All right, so now we're broadcasting. So we hit screen share. We click on that. We click share. And now anything that happens over here will happen on here. There's about like a minute delay, if that. And then whenever you're done, just hit stop broadcasting.
Why do I need that?
Yeah, you're going to forward this link to people. All right, you're good to go. And then whenever you're done, just come back to the screen, stop broadcasting. It's the one. Yeah, it's Google Hangouts. So you can do anything on that monitor there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Oh, yeah.
Get the young guy in, he knows what he's doing. Thanks, Eric.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a good warm up since I'm running.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Eric.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to send anyone else while I'm here? Is that good? Is there anyone else you want me to send it to? Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's what I got. I don't know where Jamie is. Okay, so. I don't know if this. What's the
So the handles, I mean, you could actually rotate or not. So the handles meant to rotate, or just it makes it easier to move? Yeah. No. Yes.
Hi, did someone join the conference?
That's her phone. That's it'd be nice if I could figure out how to do stuff like that.
Well, our new space is supposed to be the hotness.
Yeah, well,
The rest will be covered.
Yeah, oh yeah. This deal. I'll go to touch those things.
That is for operating work. I mean, as far as just power should work.
my newest phone is the phone with the headset. So I can do the operator.
Yeah.
So it's got the it's got the single ear thing and the microphone.
Well, every spot in our new space is supposed to be.
Yeah.
But it's got a thing that sits on the desk, next to the phone that sits on the desk, next to your docking station that sits on the desk. The only thing that doesn't sit on the desk is the monitors, because they're on.
We're all separate. Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
There's gonna be very space.
When I see one of the floors and Revenue is like that, and there I think the prime real estate is always away from the middle of the bulkhead. So you can do a corner, or if you do like a weird thing like the elevator, like you get yourself in like a little niche though. That's sort of out of the ring traffic and all those. If you like.
Sounds like it's like
I think they'll have some floors. One thing San Diego had was like a floor. Like I came in, they would have like an actual office with a door and a bell and a spot for people who are visitors, but not necessarily for the regular folks. But it's 10 o'clock and it's taking a visitor spot. It's like, you might be fair game. So.
Alright. Here it says it's going to be a few minutes late joining the call.
guess it's actually. So Scarecrow's gonna just move,
He's gonna try. I think he's got a presentation 2:30 at California, so that's gonna be like right in the middle of the Air Regions conference. And he's doing a presentation with CDOT.
oh,
Oh,
Yeah. I know. I just kind of found out too.
So,
Yeah.
what we did, what I already told you on the phone this morning is if needed, to perform a tuition to explain over that and all that.
Yeah, he did look at the presentation and he said that he may have some questions later.
Okay.
So yeah, hopefully he can go over that. I'm sure he'll.
yeah. Most of the newer stuff's towards the end, so if he does get a chance to come on.
Yeah, I think 2:30 California comes up. 1:31, so I don't see him getting on the call.
Yeah.
So what is it?
I was like, you told me this morning about a presentation. And I was like, I was almost like, but if it ever comes like that, like,
Next week? Yeah, I know, but I think they review all that stuff and
They have stuff in
yeah, that's what I thought. Did he tell you about what happened with I know. It's a mess over there. It's bad. So, and Lisa's gone and Josh resigned. So yeah.
That's crazy.
I'm like,
Yeah.
well, and they were basically the two putting it together.
Apparently not, because they're
They're
they're trying to, yeah, but people are not happy with them though. I mean, yeah, so now my contact is some dude in Atlanta. So, well, yeah. So I emailed him and I said, I'm disappointed in you guys. We had this commitment and Josh said no one from Atkins was coming. And then so then I canceled and then I emailed him and then he emailed me back and said, oh no, we have several Atkins people coming. I'm like, who's going? Yeah, and if they're coming, I don't know who they are, I've never worked with them and and it's too late, so yeah. Yeah, it was just best to cancel. I think just not knowing everything up in the air. I only saw the product once, so it was just kind of like I wasn't going to do it by myself. Like a fool. I'd rather look like a fool other times. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. So anyway. Don't do that. Don't be like that. No,
well, a lot of their legacy PBS and J where they have local markets pretty strong.
Yeah.
So like Region 4, like in Florida, where their PBS News was really based, and North Carolina and those places. They have.
I think they're doing well.
Established sort of things there, but
I know there are issues in this region in other states too. They were working on Montana and North Dakota. Yeah.
Because it's a big body, it's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, part of the problem is this huge corporation and their philosophy. Well, I don't know, he comes pretty big. But you guys, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I'm locally, it was just Lisa and Josh. Yeah. I don't know. I just don't think that they were on top of everything that was going on and the requirements and yeah, and these were all like old legacy projects. So it's not, they weren't complicated. It was just simple submissions that were just being overlooked. So it was a management issue. Yeah, so anyway. Should probably figure out how we move forward on this.
Is it just like normal where you would just do the display? Like the full screen version, the little screen icon down there?
I see. I am not accessing that. I don't see that on screen here, so I guess I should figure this out.
Oh, so that's like a second screen? Is that what's?
Yeah.
So can you make your mouse go over?
Here, let me see. I think if I go, yeah, my mouse is over it. Yeah, I'm sure. I have to go get the young one. Let's see. Let's see.
At our church, I do all the presentations constantly. So I found really good. We could use a projector for doing a screen freeze. So you can screen freeze it like a thing, and then you can make your own logo.
Why is it doing it over here?
Oh, it's a little concerning when it's starting the slideshow and all the as you start the PowerPoint, shut up.
Solid. There we go.
Project slides.
Okay.
Perfect.
Project slides, go for that.
No. It basically just goes with the keyboard and mouse the way that it normally does. I just had it.
I have it in my office. Do you want it?
No, I'm just saying.
Oh.
Do you want the mouse or do you want to use just the?
Either way, or I can just tell someone to advance it. There's only a few slides where there's like a progression of things, but that's only one or two spots. So.
Sweet. Okay. Yeah, I should do it.
And it's more so we bring it
Okay, yeah. I'll go ahead and take it around. All right, cool.
Hopefully that works.
Thanks, Eric. Okay. It's pretty cool, huh?
It's totally cool.
So you don't have to pay for the Meet Me or the, whatever other program. It's just through Google. So,
I was still in the street going back to the street yesterday, and we were just on the front campus, and I was telling them how great it was as a thing that we did last week. And I mean, my favorite thing about it was the festival.
oh yeah, that was pretty cool. Yeah. I didn't even know you could do that.
I didn't either until Rigel and I were looking at it 2 days before, and he's like, "Hey, look at this." And I was like, "That's fantastic."
So kind of platform independent or whatever the code is. It's
Yeah,
cool.
it's so you don't have to maintain multiple versions.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, like if that's a new thing. I mean, I've never seen that.
No, it's been out.
Oh, really?
So I think it's not like.
I mean, but I wouldn't know. We rely on like the techie people to kind of be on top of the technology. Yeah, so that's great. So
Yeah, once it's online, stuff is on there. It's kind of good.
Yeah, I think the newer coding protocols like are meant to be more broad use, where the older ones like, oh, we work on this, that, or that thing.
mhm.
Yeah, and then it has to be. That's what I had is requires.
Right. Anything that goes through an iPhone is always
Recognizes screens.
different, permissions to get used to it.
One of the local news stations right now, all of the names that they're listed because I do not remember that.
Really?
Is it Flash based or something? Or?
I guess, I'm not really sure, but every time I try to pull up a video to watch, because I follow all of the local news stations on Facebook. And it's like, well, black screen. This video is not going to test. It's not really a great way to
No.
create a news service.
I just think it would have all detect and swap them or something.
Well, I mean, because I've seen many complaints about the issue. Their usership.
Yeah.
Especially in the competition. So,
People don't have patience for that kind of stuff either.
No.
So we move on. Did you get my other message today? Another maker person? Okay. So you keep track of all that. Is that... Hello? Okay. Awesome. Can you see the screen? You can? Good. All right. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I know. I'm excited.
Yeah, we were all impressed over at the office here. Like, wow.
Usually we're kind of behind everyone, but we're like we're cutting edge now. Yeah.
Yeah, this is awesome.
So you guys want to? I've got a few folks here. I'll just have them introduce themselves. We might have one.
Yeah, of course. You know, David Freeman.
Hi, Dave. This is Kim. Harry from AECOM.
and this is Shane Parson, also from AECOM, back from out your wonderful way from Virginia. Work a lot with the HAZUS and the non-reg products for AECOM.
Yes.
And then we got Twee here.
Oh yeah, and I'm here. All right. So Shane's put together a presentation. So you just want to go ahead and get started.
Yeah. So if you want to give us a fancy through, so we'll. Let's see. Here we go.
Okay.
So I'm going to sit for most of it. I may stand up at some point. And everyone can stand up at some point too. If you start getting tired at this after lunch time frame, sometimes hard to do. So what I'm going to go through is sort of an overview of what this sort of the scope of what this task order was about, which is really to look at flood forecasting, kind of big picture, what are the different components and parts of it, and then look at what's already in Colorado, both pros and cons, and then when we look at those systems that are out there, what are ways that things that we do in a risk map, either default data sets, or probably more importantly, are there ways that we can take what we do in risk map and sort of enhance them slightly and let them then aid in or be part of flood forecast systems. So, you know, it seems like if we're all modeling flooding of some sort and we're all figuring out where the water goes, that there should be ways that this data can be leveraged from one to the other. So that's kind of the overview of what we're going to go through, is just kind of what do we know about forecasting, what's being done in Colorado, but then where are those linkages between the two. So first part of the overview, and actually I'm going to hand it over to Kim for this one because these are a couple of her pictures that she's got local here.
So this is just kind of the reason why these photos are kind of illustrating how we're interested in flood forecasting. This is a photo that you guys might have seen before. It's one of the Civil Air Patrol photos from the 2013 flood event. This is the South Platte River in Morgan County. It happens to be where I have a roadway permanent recovery project that we're going to see that. So the orange arrow will become important when we look at the next series of photos. And that is a spot where the roadway, this whole section of roadway parallels the river. And there's a bridge further down. The bridge actually worked perfectly through the flood, but this whole section of roadway was overtopped during the 2013 flood event and washed away. So then these photos were from earlier this year when we were having our flood events in May and June, and the South Platte was up again, and I happened to be out there on June 17th. And you can see the top two photos are from June 17th. We're out doing some field recon for our project, and the orange arrow on the left side of the photos is on that particular tree. It's the same tree in the top photo and the bottom photo. So in the space of a week, the river was up when we were out there. I mean, you can see in the top photos how close it is to the right-of-way fencing, which was about 6 to 8 feet from the edge of pavement. And then you can see in the bottom photo, just a week later, the river had continued to come up, and as is typical with the South Platte, it changed direction a little bit and decided it wanted to run towards the roadway, and it took out a bit of the embankment. So, you know, having some understanding of how the river process is going to go on may have helped see that prepare for this.
Thanks, Kim. So one of the themes I think throughout the presentation today is that a lot of what we do for kind of FEMA regulatory mapping, we have our sort of set return periods and we have our set way that we do things. But for flood forecasting, we're looking at a broader range of conditions. And that range of conditions can be everything from a very small storm to, like with the 2013 event, something that even goes and exceeds in certain locations any of the modeling that we had before. This was a good, and I put the link in here, and we can give you an email to it. This is a good publication put out by the World Meteorology Organization about flood forecasting and flood warning. And I thought it was the best graphic I've seen. It doesn't have all of the nice little inset picture graphics, but I thought it was probably one of the most comprehensive I've seen of sort of the way that these systems work, which is you have this external data coming from river and stream gauges, from satellite imagery, from Weather Service radar, or radar modeling systems where they'll say tomorrow, what's the forecast? And they bring all that stuff into a system, which is the big red box for the system shell. It's then synthesized in sort of a data gathering module. And then it goes into a forecast module which is a mix of both computer models, but then also people and their judgment. So for instance, the National Weather Service will have their various offices and their various forecast locations that will take this information and then use it to come up with, let's issue a warning here. Let's tell people about this there. Or with the urban drainage type of forecast system, they may have something automated that says if this gauge gets this high, then our flood routing model says flooding will happen here. Let's now issue this sort of warning in this spot. So the forecast module lives within the shell, but its main purpose is really to take the input data, assess it in some form, and then turn it into information that can be used for both a forecast of how high something may get, but then also if the forecast hits certain thresholds, what sort of warnings want to be issued from that data. And so our challenge really, and when you look at this, is there's a lot of parts of this system, actually go to our next slide, that aren't really part of our typical riverine floodplain modeling system. So when we do kind of our typical thing, a lot of the getting to peak flows on rivers, the modeling that we use with that gets into why FEMA has us do modeling. So when we're doing a regulatory 100-year 1% annual chance event, we've got the set rules that say, well, use regression equations in some spots, use gauge data in others. In more complex situations, you may use rainfall runoff or other things. But in the end, you end up getting this peak flow value, this peak runoff, that you then put through your hydraulic, your HEC-RAS, and everything else, and then eventually to your floodplain. So this system that we go through and we model when we do FEMA work is really a part within that larger modeling and forecasting that we do. And in fact, even parts of this we'll talk about later. A lot of the hydrology analysis that we do in floodplain work may not necessarily be, so when we say with FEMA mapping, say we have a confluence of, two rivers come together, another river comes out from that. We have the 100-year and the 100-year, and then, the new 100-year coming out from there. Unless it's the magic coincident peaks where they actually line up, mathematically, if the peak is, 10,000 CFS here and 20,000 CFS there, probably that resulting river downstream is not 30,000. It's like maybe 25 or 24 because of the timing of the peaks and everything else. But on an actual flood event, you may have one side that's, that let's say the storm went up that subwatershed and basin. Maybe that one's seeing a 200-year event, and this other one is seeing a 5-year or a 10-year. So you have these combinations of events in a real-world situation that we really don't take account for when we do our FEMA modeling. And so the challenge is often how much of this information can be pre-calculated and available, and how much of it do you actually have to have essentially a live model with a knowledgeable person available to run it and interpret it and use it. So if you want to go to the next one. And so this balance, this is a graphic, actually, we use this a lot with HAZUS modeling, the three-legged stool idea, but in a lot of the forecast systems, the main differences come down to how complex of models do you have available, what people do you have available to run them or to interpret them, and the money aspect also gets back to the time aspects of things. If you're making a prediction for flooding on, let's say, Glenwood Springs on the Colorado River, your amount of warning time and that's the time of concentration to when the peak comes is different than if you're right at the Big Thompson's coming down, you've got small warning times. So this balance of the people in the models and how frequently you need to deal with the data often comes back to also kind of the flashiness of the flooding that you're needing to predict. And on the South Platte, like how long did you say it took for that peak to go up and down?
Yeah,
Spot?
South Platte takes a week to 10 days easily.
So the modeling needs for further downstream on the South Platte or the Colorado is almost fundamentally a different type of prediction and modeling. That's something where you need something in the next 4 or 5 hours. And in 4 and 5, so if, I mean, in our FEMA world where we talk about months and years to do our modeling and our work, if someone called Revit tonight and said, by midnight, I need your prediction for what the water's going to be at X,
Yeah.
The way we set up that system is really different than the way that we do our FEMA work.
Yeah.
So how can we leverage that data and make it work, but at the same time knowing that you're not going to have an EOC with 20 H&H modelers at beck and call at any moment of the day to do that.
Yeah, actually, this summer when we had all that flooding, got a call from town of Evans, and they were wanting some help. You know, are we gonna flood this weekend? Can help them. So, yeah.
No, I mean, if there's a need.
Yeah, there's a
Yeah.
need. Yeah, there's a need. And yeah,
So in Colorado, the four main, if you go to the next slide, kind of the four main systems we'll talk about a little bit that are out there. The National Weather Service set up kind of what they have available in terms of both prediction and forecasting, but also some tools that they're rolling out nationwide. Then right here, CWCB, some of the tools and websites that are available. And then a little bit of a deeper dive into the urban drainage system. One of the neat things is they're pretty good about posting up on their website some of the information and even some of the models that they have available. So we'll do a couple slides with that. And then Fort Collins system, which is not as extensive as Denver's, but I think one of the interesting things there is they've already kind of gone that next step on the warning end and then brought in social media, and they have a lot of the automated alerts as part of their systems. So here again, our next. So one of the things I thought I'd put on here that's a good thing to always keep in mind with these prediction and forecasting systems is in Colorado, being on the Continental Divide, and with the Denver area having high metro and high stormwater and man-made drainage features versus some of the other areas, the way that these things are modeled and set up and need to be maintained are different in each location. So when you're going like in the Arkansas drainage, if you're almost at the eastern state border, the way that you would maintain and set up a system for communities there is going to be a lot different than right here on the Front Range versus, like I said earlier, going out to Colorado or some of the other drainages on the western part of the state. So that's another consideration, is that moving forward as we look to maybe pilot some of these data sets, the areas where they've been done, often it's being driven because people are already there. But if you were to sort of demo out what data could be used, the way we would do like a Colorado is different than what we do for some parts of the South Platte. The two things that National Weather Service has, they don't necessarily have the most broad rainfall set of gauges. The Weather Service relies a lot on their radar systems and on the forecasting that comes from that radar, which most of your local news stations usually can tap into that sort of data for that. So they'll have gauging setups, and I don't know if you've ever seen these. Most of them, some of them are tipping buckets where the amount of rainfall caused the tipping bucket to go back and forth. But some of the ones that are more automated, it's actually a pressure sensor. So it's an actual almost like a membrane, and so it'll sense how intense the rainfall is. The trouble with those is they have to be calibrated, and with the if you have a lot of frequent rainfall and you can go out and sort of make sure they're kept in sync, it's all right. So tipping buckets tend to be the preferred method for rainfall, although with a lot of frozen precip, then sometimes those systems you have to have you have to actually warm things up, and they can be a little problematic in areas with heavy snow. So again, the Weather Service don't have the most extensive rainfall gauge, and they, like I said, they rely back more so on the radar and the radar processing. And there's links out there if you've ever read into it. The radar, so we're so used to raster data that's set up on a Cartesian or a grid. That data is actually a polar raster. So if you've ever looked at on the news, so you'll have a pixel that's actually curved on two sides and straight, and then it gets bigger the further away it gets. So you have to have special GIS processing tools to deal with that data, and the data also gets shadows from larger mountains and other things. So it's almost its own specialty science into itself to interpret rainfall radar data to then turn it into something that we can put into the conventional GIS that we work with. So that's the story with rainfall. I'm going to grab our next slide. Your stream and river gauges are much more extensive. One of the things that, and this is, well, I pulled up the site in Colorado. One of the big things with National Weather Service is they try to have as much standardized products and looks nationwide. So you could look at almost any state in the US and you'd have a similar look of both the data that's out there. In this case, they use a color coding of saying which gauges they think are either at flood stage, so the green means everything's good, or if there are some that are either out of service or have problems, you know, they do try to have that. I think the big thing that I've seen is that these gauging stations, and at the national level, like ASFPM's talked about this, there are not long-term, well-maintained, well-funded. The network, even this extensive, is not as extensive as it should be. So there's a lot of places, like down there along the Arkansas, you may have them at given intervals, but probably maybe 1 in 5 of those might be there for more than 30 years. You know, so you may have some that go in, but you don't have a huge number of them that have been there long enough. And for the flood work that we do, challenge you ends up with is, let's say for a given, you know, watershed, you want to use a particular gauge. If the history of record is only 25, 30 years, the uncertainty that goes with them predicting a 100-year event, when, you know, that history is so short, ends up being tough. And then it also means, has that gauge ever seen a type of event like the 2013 events? So that's another thing. And just from my own personal history with gauge networks, they tend not to be built strong enough for when the really big events come. So what's really frustrating is that often the very event you wanted them to record, the big one, is the thing that then takes them out. At the ASFPM conference in Atlanta, they showed this one gauge that previously was along this local river, and it was maybe 8 or 9 feet from kind of the normal river height to where it was. They installed this new gauge atop of this tower that was like 20 foot up. So they built this. I don't even know how that tower is going to survive unless it's like, you know, anchored, you know, 10 foot deep in concrete or something. But they built this big tall tower to put their gauge thing in because they knew from past events that, you know, so it can be a challenge. So for one of these gauges, and I just picked one along the Colorado, if you want to click through in the next one. So this is the Colorado River at Cameo, and this just gives an idea on the gauges where they have the river prediction centers and the flood prediction centers come up with not only showing the blue line, which is the current observed, but they'll also give in that purple line where their forecast is going out. In this case, it looks like they've got, let's say, a 1, 2, 3, 4, like a 5-day forecast going out, you know, along that site. That forecast, and again, their website doesn't get into all the details, but that forecast will have behind it their estimates of if there's going to be additional rainfall, how they figure that the flood wave is going to propagate down the river, but it has a heavy human involvement. So that both the staff at a national level and also at this particular Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, along with the Grand Junction Weather Service office, all of their staff will work together to produce the data that's shown here. So this is not, you know, if everyone at the Weather Service comes down with the flu, it's not a fully automated system. So they have a lot of people involvement behind this, and especially when there's peak events coming. And on this particular graph, you can just see the yellow and the orange up top. If the levels were higher, if the stages were higher, you can actually see the other red and purple for the moderate and the major flood stages also included in as part of the data that they have behind the scenes. For this particular site, I went ahead and just looked at the FIS, and it said here that the 10-year is about 33,000 CFS, which is almost around that major flood stage level. So the Weather Service, when they're saying these various flood categories, in this case and in many others, a lot of these demarcations are below even our lowest thing that we usually do within the FEMA work, which I found honestly kind of surprising that that a lot of them are at that level. But then I did think about it. If you go to our next slide, and these are a couple vacation pictures. So my family came out here this summer. So this is on I-70 heading east to west and actually coming up along this section in the Palisades area along Colorado. So if you go to the next slide, so some areas, and the reason, and this is the Weather Service, their predictions and their warnings are often meant to deal with out-of-bank situations. So if you think of a bank full as like a 2 or 2.3 year event, they're dealing with events that are on the range of that 2 to 10 year type of event. And in some cases like this, where the interstate is higher up than the Colorado on the left, you know, where would the highway first being impacted? It might be a 10-year event. It might be something more severe. If you go to the next slide, here where the bridge goes over the river, and you can say, well, it's kind of close to bank full. We went through there about mid-June, but you can still see that, you know, it could probably still go up a little bit where this bridge wouldn't be too bad. But if you go to our last picture, you know, there are situations just like what Kim showed along the South Platte, where it doesn't take much out of bank flooding to have, in this case, an interstate highway that's going to be underwater. So a lot of the motivation in what the National Weather Service and with those stage-based flooding, a lot of it is not so much these, you know, 10-year, 10% annual chance or these larger events that we talk about with FEMA flooding. It's really kind of in the, if you want to call it the nuisance flooding or the more frequent events, it's in those more frequent events because folks are expecting the Weather Service to tell them don't go on I-70 east for the next couple of days because the water's probably going to be up. So the type of predictions they're doing are really looking at these more low-lying features than maybe typically we look at when we do kind of FEMA-based work. So another thing with National Weather Service is they have these forecast zones, and this was another thing I had, in each state, the way they draw these things are a little different. In some cases, you can see in the east, they're kind of full counties. As you get closer to the Front Range, things are sort of split by watershed, but they're kind of, you know, and in some cases, there's some really small ones, but in a lot of cases, you're talking about significant portions of maybe a given county. So what's hard is the National Weather Service is not going to be able to really give you this one gauge, this particular stream reach, based on these forecast zones. They're just not going to be able to be as detailed enough as often people would like to know because of the way that now, if in areas, let's say that urban drainage and others cover, they will have more detailed information. But with the Weather Service, so if you look at one of these zones, like let's say up in the northeast corner of the state, they may just have one rainfall gauge or one river gauge that may be the thing that triggers or doesn't trigger whether or not they give a warning to those areas. So again, the detail level, they're relying on their staff to take what data is there and interpret it. So you can almost think of that forecast box as a bunch of guys in an office with a few models is the way that they're coming up with a lot of these sort of forecasts. If you want to go to our next one. So one thing that they have been doing to try to address the idea that a lot of their forecast information doesn't have flood inundation is that starting back in 2011, they established some guidelines for where you have USGS gauging or other stream or river gauging. What are some standards where you could have information to show on the web related to flood depths? And so they have established these standards. And what's interesting about this standards book is the methods that are in it are often, in fact, in some cases, are identical to the guidelines that we use for risk map, for some of the mapping. If you want to go to the next slide. Nationwide, the blue points are where they have done this type of mapping in the US. There's none in Colorado at this point. Most of them are concentrated in some states where either the state has additional funding or the Weather Service has leveraged some one-time funding. So New Jersey, post-Sandy, has a bunch. North Carolina always can find money, so they've done some. And Texas yeah, I believe so. But I believe if you zoom in on that Boise one, it may be like 1 or 2 spots only, is all that they have. So the Weather Service is starting to try to get into more local predictions, but I mean, it comes down to, like with everything else, is that the funding is limited and the amount of effort involved to develop this can be challenging. So I decided just to try to pick one close to here. So I picked one of the points in Kansas. So this is an idea, and actually I'll stand up and I'll describe on the phone what I'm pointing to up here. So this study, it's really kind of faint purple, but there's essentially kind of limits of study denoted on the graphic. So at the lower end down here, there's a confluence with this creek, and then above the gauge, there's actually also a point. So in their guidelines, they consider these kind of limits of study as sort of the reach or the area that flooding based on information from that one gauge would reach to. So they're saying that downstream, until you reach a major confluence and the flow changes, you can be pretty confident that what you see at that gauge, the flooding downstream would be that. And then upstream, there's also a shorter reach, but also a section. We can be pretty sure that that gauge is representative of the flooding. So if you win or lose the lottery, depending on your viewpoint, if you're in that magic reach, look, you can have all sorts of great information. But unfortunately, if you're anywhere else outside of where they just happen to model, you don't have anything. So one of the things that they did, if you look on the left side of the screen, is that they have actually pre-calculated these flood depth grids for every single one of those elevations that are denoted on the side. So what's shown on the screen right now is the stage 31 feet flooding. But if we go through just a couple of these slides here, you can see, so they will have, so I'll zoom in on the gauge, and then as you go up, if you just go to the next slide. So for instance, this one is a stage 17 feet, which is approximately, and you can see on the left, it's the one that's in yellow, is right below what they have as their record crest for the site. You can see it looks like this is probably LiDAR based because there's a lot of the finer features in the floodplain are showing up. And then what they've got on this website then is that you click along the left side. So if you just go up next couple of slides, you can click up and basically pull up with a little bit of a lag any of these depth grids that they've already pre-calculated for each of these stages. So go one more. Yeah, that's the highest. So there's the 31 feet. So what they've essentially done, rather than saying we're going to come up with flood depth grids for a 10-year, a 50-year, 100-year, what they've done is they've said, let's come up with a depth grid for stage 12. Well, stage 12 means what? It means a flood elevation of, looks like 1,053. So they've run their HEC-RAS models and then developed inundation and depth grids based on that particular stage at that gauge. And then they've gone up a foot from there and a foot from, so they have these single foot increments, and in the guidelines, they actually have that you could even do this to half-foot increments. So they've essentially just gone in and just popped in all of these elevations relative to the stage at the gauge. And then you as a user could come into this, and at any given time, it will say the gauge tells me my stage is 19 feet. It will then pull up and show you this depth raster. The thing that this doesn't have though, and I'll show it at the end, is just like everything else we do. This shows you the flood extent, but it doesn't show you where the people are. Or it doesn't show you, you can see where the roads are, but like that one street there that looks like it's flooded pretty good and it's going up the sides, it's just, in lack of a better term, a dumb depth grid. It doesn't actually have behind it then, should you make a warning to people in this neighborhood or that neighborhood? So they haven't kind of gone that next step with the information. It's just simply an additional visual tool to give them information. But, it's definitely more extensive, and for someone in that locality, a lot more detail than what they've ever had access to before.
So whatever the stage is in yellow, and then it just
Right.
give you the ranges real time.
So they'll do it real time, or you can in this web interface. I went through and just clicked them to be able to see the different ones. But they will. So the neat thing is, like on the slide a couple of ago where they were just showing the stage itself, you could actually go to.
Go back.
Yeah, go back a few. So like for the one on the Colorado, go back one more. Oh, it's too far back. Anyway, so all the ones where you can actually see kind of the stages as you go.
Yeah.
These sites are linked in such that, let's say 2 days out, they predict the peak on the river. If I click on that curve at where that peak is, it'll then take me to this page if this data is available and show me what it looks like. So they have them all, again, because they have this nationwide standard. If you develop the data in an archive, in a library, in the formats they want, they can then feed it and put it on their site.
The National Weather Service.
The National Weather Service, right.
Okay.
And this standard, so the National Weather Service published it, but they're using USGS gauges. So USGS also can help provide this data. You notice that they have in partnership with the Corps and them.
Yeah.
So some of this work has actually been done by USGS. A few sites of Corps has done it. But it's not, in terms of how extensive, you saw that previous map, it's a couple little pockets. It's nothing fully nationwide, and really where they've done it, we have, like post Sandy, they had some money in certain counties in New Jersey.
I saw them present this in Montana back in July, and they were requesting any interest. They're kind of funding it, or there was funding. You mentioned that earlier, right? So are they still looking for states that, air locations that are interested?
What I saw at the National Weather Service site, they have like quarterly bulletins on this program, and I think like each region of the U.S. has a certain pot of money each year that they can allocate to this, but it's probably like in the tens of thousands. It's nothing. In some ways, you would almost need to have this piggyback on like a risk map effort or some other mapping effort, because in and of itself, they're not going to have, it's not like they can go out and fly LiDAR or do other things.
Right.
So I've seen 2 talks on this at ASFPM over the years where they've tried to leverage the other data that you get from FEMA studies, but National Weather Service still appears, let's put it this way, Dewberry actually wrote the standards for them. So they're leveraging with FEMA study contractors, but yet I didn't see any evidence where they are, like FEMA is not listed in their partnership list. They still have not sort of kind of put it together to say, oh, 80% of the data that we need to do this, we get from studies.
Yeah, that'd be too easy.
That'd be too easy, right.
David, you still there? Maybe you can talk to some people.
So I'm very familiar with everything that you presented so far.
Well, that's tell me if I'm telling any lies then out of school, but no, I think one of our big challenges is I've always seen it is the staff at the Weather Service, you've got the methods and the way to do things, but I don't see at times where like FEMA will have great data and how it ever gets leveraged or not leveraged then in some of those forecasts that do come out.
That's really, the problem is during an event, like having access and actually being able to utilize, more innovation areas of influence that have been developed for different areas. Because like this innovation happening today has the market so limited in the area, but obviously there's really innovation areas that have been done for areas that could be easily do better. Try to have warning. Very, like I said, more frequent events, like not quite, the return period of the flood essentially around that's better than 90. That's what I like about the legislature, the way FEMA has a very strict 100-year, return period is determined. The floodplain is my personal disagreement, but it's going to have to investigate, but to really make all impact is to do what it is. I really think that, leveraging who our non-mandatory input to provide better information in regards to the stages and correlating those stages with the weather service forecast. Essentially, that phase would be potentially discharge. We would do a pretty good job of providing visibility to forecast.
Yeah, I think traditionally FEMA, when they were using, let's say, lesser quality terrain data, I think the concern was if you went below the 10-year, you just didn't have the precision of the data to feel confident that you could do a bank full or a 5-year event. I think now with LiDAR data, honestly, I think some of those concerns have gone away because, I mean, other than going in and doing bathymetry on every creek or river to get more detailed channel bottom geometry, there's not much more detail you could get of the outside of the bank data than the LiDAR data we're getting now. So.
You're absolutely right. I think our demonstrators are one of the strongest players that we have in these letters communities. They would be able to show you everything. A lot of times it's going in line. I think this effort is going to be one way to represent better. Do a better job. Speaking of the further trade space and putting in a forecast, you're absolutely right. Putting in a forecast so heavily reliant on that human factor. And the modeling is used in situations where there's really large roads. I do a lot of modeling. I do a lot of models that don't involve relatively temporary forecast. The only river we actually forecast with your audit model was the Mississippi itself. We actually have real time for the entire region of Mississippi from Illinois all the way down to Ohio to Mexico. So, but everywhere else, it's all the Saxon model. So basically, the kind of full moisture accounting, just accounting what's going in, what's going out, before they actually the business station. So, being able to, I think the connection we should make from the FEMA data to the weather service is that connection between discharges that we have mapped inundation areas in the form of deficits into the weather service log is stated and then discharge estimates based on the reading that their phase locations in order to start to build that profile of mitigation for every problem.
Well, that's good. You give me some good justification for some of our graphics at the end, so I like that. So.
The main thing is like you sort of Colorado, what it would take to actually be impact on the Colorado in that area, pretty very, very significant. But with other areas, a major flood one stream would be pretty fairly frequently, like we did on the flat, for example.
Well, that's good, and I want this to be kind of open discussion too, because some of the things, especially towards the end, that I'll propose out there, I think are beginning steps, but especially drawing on everyone's experience. It seems like there's a lot of information available in different spots, but if we can find a way to link them, that's probably. It's not that we don't know what these channels look like or we don't know good terrain, but how can we take it from being buried in the MIP somewhere to then being used for the weather service or being used by one of these local predictions, and how best to do that. So another site that we put in because we're here today is CWCB's Colorado Flood Threat Bulletin that's out. And I'll give credit. This is something that is provided by some colleagues and competition of ours from Dewberry, but it's also a very National Weather Service style of outlook. So they'll be taking the weather radar information and forecasts, and then looking at, if you go to the next slide, providing some predictions and mapping as they look at both the current threats on a shorter time scale and then going out a little further. You'll notice their flood threat levels is the same sort of color scheme, National Weather scheme of yellow, orange, red, purple type of thing. So, another part of it is also, even though it seems like a minor thing, but to the public, the dreaded purple flood, I mean, the connotation that goes with the colors and the standards of kind of using a similar look to what you see in other places as well. So that, okay, well, yellow is something we want to be careful of, but it may not be as severe. They also will have information sort of summarizing, or for given events, they'll come in and also give some information moving forward, either where it's giving a prediction of the future, or if a past event had been in as well, so to sort of, to sort of document where some of that flooding has been. But it's meant to be, as opposed to sort of a comprehensive local thing, it's meant to be a larger sort of a bulletin. I don't know, have you worked with the folks that have done any of that? So it's a good site to get a one-stop shop for information, and it is formatted, I think, a little bit more intuitively than some of the stuff that I've seen on the Weather Service site. We have to dig a little further to get it. But again, its purpose is more so of that overview, and especially for like a decision maker type. You see on the news all that, looks like a bad front's coming this way in a week or something. What might that do? That this can at least give you a spot to go and look and have a sense of, is this something that we need to start thinking about ramping up an EOC, or is this just something that we need to keep our eye on and reassess in a day or two?
So there's more actual meteorology.
Yeah, I think it's got a little bit more modeling behind some of it, and it's if you look at the detail level of some of these things, it quickly goes into meteorology jargon and speech pretty quick.
That's what I've noticed, that hearing about this, yesterday or last year.
Yeah, I remember that. Yep. Yeah.
So it seemed like to a large degree it was based on actual traditional forecasting, as in weather-based forecasting, which obviously is just a different piece of information for the puzzle.
Right.
Not necessarily apples to apples to take data.
So it's more so in that schematic of a warning system. It's less in the running a flood model section and more so in the data compilation part of things. But again, it is another valuable tool you can look at.
Something like the rainfall is going to be well behaved today or something like that.
Well behaved, right? All right, so urban drainage. So they're tied on, and I've seen this acronym of alert used in other warning and forecast systems around the country. So I'm not sure if alert, I tried to do a little bit of background, if it was their name or if it was a standard name for the type of system they have. But it is an acronym for a type of system. And what they've really done is they've tried to go on that next step to have a more model-based approach for doing the forecasting for an area. If you go to the next slide, so one of the things you'll notice right away is their gauging system for both rainfall and for stream and river gauges is much more extensive than what National Weather Service has, and is more widespread as well. A couple advantages of that, obviously, is you have more data, but also this issue of, let's say, rain gauges that have to be calibrated or may not give you something worthwhile. When you have that dense of a network, if 80% of them are telling you you've got an inch of rain over the last 4 hours, you can have a higher confidence in that than when you just have a single lone gauge out somewhere and all of a sudden you get a high reading. You're like, is that real or not? So having that denser network also helps deal with those issues of just confidence in data and data gaps and those sort of things as well. If you go to the next slide, some of the data that they'll have in it. So I picked location for where they have one of these setups. And interestingly, they'll actually have flow gauging on rivers and streams co-located also with the rainfall. So in this case, you'll have both precipitation information both increment from a certain amount of time or accumulation over a certain amount of time, but also the stage and then the associated flow rates on that river or stream. So they'll have a whole instrument cluster in a given location, as opposed to some of the National Weather Service stuff where these things are more separated out from one another. And then you can even go, so if like you clicked on, let's say, flow rate or one of these others, if you go ahead and hit the slide, then they'll have additional information where you can bring up graphs looking at, so in this case of the precipitation accumulation, you know, in this case, it looks like you got 0.04 of an inch of rain somewhere, you know, in the middle of August 31st in a given area. Now, was it instantaneous or not? You know, again, you know, some of the scale things in the way that these are measured, you know, it probably picked up a thing at a certain time. If you just want to click again. Same with the gauging information. When you see something like this, where you have two little mini peaks, you know, or spikes there, you know, so part of it is, you know, did the CFS go up that high, that instantly or not? One thing that's interesting near where I live in Virginia is we have a power supply dam along one of our rivers, and every day at a certain time they do their release, and that certain water comes through. And so when you look at the gauge downstream from the dam, you have this periodic, you know, spikes and things go up and down. So when you see something, like if I saw one spike, I'm going, well, maybe that's just a quirky little, you know, like maybe just something with the gauge. But if I see it twice and it almost looks like it's almost like the exact time of day, it makes me wonder if there may not be something on that site or something about that where there's a quick, you know, kind of release or something else going on. Right, it goes right back down again. They also have on the alert system floodplain mapping data as well. So one of the things that's interesting with this, though, if you go to the next slide, is it's essentially a you know, a version of the national, you know, flood hazard layer, I know that's out there. Yeah, and so they'll have regulatory and best available in, you know, in the locations where that does supersede or, you know, is showing. But again, on just this particular zoom in, it's just the regular, so it's only the 100-year, you know, but they do have with it as an interface. The nice thing is they do have different transparencies. You can turn on different, you know, so you can do just a street map versus aerial photography.
Yeah.
The problem is, of course, that a lot of these more frequent events aren't going to be 100 years, but at least as a tool to look at and access the data, it's a good online one. And I noticed it wasn't, and I guess it's part of this is also the newer web technology, the web 2.0. It isn't as quirky as the traditional sort of ArcIMS fed websites that always, you got to download this cookie to make this thing work. It works more like a Google Map type of thing. So it worked well, but it was still the issue of it's only the 100-year for this. Now, in addition to those viewers, they've also had as part of the site this sort of sub-site where, and it's hard for me as an H&H person, I'm like, oh cool, look at all this data. But as a general public person, I don't know how useful getting access into the guts of the real-time models. I almost feel like this may be the audience for something like this, may be a very specialized, either local engineers or decision makers. So you might have this catered for certain data differently than you might for the general public. Because if I was a general public and I went into this, if I didn't understand the jargon and how things were hidden, I don't know how useful I would find something like this. But they do have real-time data for a number of some of this data with rainfall runoff models. So they're actually taking information from the gauges, running it through rainfall runoff, and then using it to do predictions. So if you go to the next slide. So this is one of the model basins coming into Boulder. So they have their different prediction points shown with the blue water droplets. And then if you clicked on one of those droplets, let's see, let's go to the next slide. I think I've got a graphic up. It will actually give you information, both the latest model runs that they've done in a certain location, like for 4 Mile Creek above there, they'll have their predictions of both modeled and forecasted. So it's actually a pretty robust, as they do these runs. Now, it's not clear if the runs are initiated again still by a person or if this is something that the system always does on an automated, sort of time step. And then if need be, maybe someone could go in and also prompt it to do additional runs as well. I think I've got maybe one more graphic. The other thing that they show, which I found interesting, is they also include their model routing schema, which when we think about taking the FEMA work and translating it to work for forecasting, these sort of diagrams I think are going to become essential, because this is going to drive, I think, how we look at gauging and we look at prediction. So for instance, if I wanted to make, let's say, a forecast for the outlet of basin 10, I would need to have some sort of gauging within that basin because nothing else feeds into it. But if I wanted to make a prediction for, let's say, the outfall of everything, at a minimum, probably these main three branches that feed in, starting with basins 3, 7, and 11, I would need some gauging in all three of those to have some confidence that at the outfall of this whole Boulder Creek, I'm fully reflecting what everything is seeing. So I think this routing and the use of rainfall runoff models, in some ways, it gives you more robust ways to model things, but also I think conceptually, it also will give you a better sense, like, is the basin that starts with basin 11, is that half of the drainage area? Is that a quarter? So to really get a sense of, at your given point of interest, what's really influencing the flooding that's seen there? Is it rainfall on just one subbasin? Is it combinations of those? And that understanding, I think, then drives if you have to add gauges or you need better rainfall information. And it seems like urban drainage has done a good job of having dense networks, but what's not clear is, has it been done with this sort of viewpoint in mind so that they're hitting those critical spots? So it's not just one gauge gives you the prediction everywhere, but do you have the gauging kind of placed intelligently so that it reflects kind of all the water feeding into given areas? So that's going to be some of our challenges, because in the work that we do with FEMA, we'd simply put, if let's say none of these are gauged currently, or maybe one or two, we do regression equation for all these things, get numbers off for given ones, that'd be it. So that sort of whole timing and what influences where, we kind of don't deal with that a lot in some of the FEMA work that we do. Any other comments on the, have you ever worked with their stuff?
No, I think the system is probably strategically placed more so with problem areas that have been absorbed over the years. Probably since 10 years after.
Yeah.
So there's tons of data that is systematic, and we're probably feeding into category or systematic picture with all
I think the other takeaway from theirs is, in that sort of three-legged stool of models, people, and money, they're probably putting more money in, they're developing more complex models, but then they're also going to need to have in place people that can run and deal with those models. And especially when a larger event is developing, having that expertise ready and available to do all the things that are done, especially if it's more of a flash flood sort of situation, I could see them easily running into issues where a too complex computer modeled system may not actually give you the results in real time quick enough for what you need to do. So you could run into that issue of, if things aren't pre-run or if you don't have a library of information available, that you might have challenges in certain spots to actually get the model to spit out what you need quick enough for what you're doing. Fort Collins is the last one here in Colorado. It's sort of the baby brother of urban drainages, so it's not as extensive. It doesn't cover as wide of an area. One of the things that I liked about what they had, though, was on the very first page, they gave you a link to real-time data. They had you, if you wanted to, you could actually connect in to data through the community's E911 system. And it was not just for the flood forecasting, but for all sorts of hazardous events and everything else. So they saw having access to information important for flooding, but they also saw this as a way to engage people to want to get information about a range of hazards as well. So I actually followed some of their links in for the E911. So they would give you wildfire reports, and they give you severe winter weather, and they would have a lot of different information that by signing up for this data service, you know, it would help provide too. So they kind of saw the flooding as not just all we do is flooding, but it is as part of this larger natural hazard picture for the community. So again, you can see their gauge network, you know, probably not quite as extensive as urban drainages. Just a zoom in on one of them. So if we pick, if you go to the next slide. So if I pick one of these locations, and then we'll just click through a few of these. So they'll have the gauge coming out, they'll have the stage and the flow associated with it. If you wanted to see some historical information, you know, they'll give water depth in the stage. So very similar to the look of the National Weather Service information. If you click one more. And then if you're part of this warning system, this would be the sort of alert that their system would give out to say, okay, you know, the National Weather Service, you know, working from this data expects there to be, and it's interesting, I don't know if I've ever seen a warning alert that actually gives you the CFS. I don't know how much the public would 77,000 CFS. Oh, that might really be bad. You know, I mean, you still need to relate it to, you know, small creek flooding or large river flooding or overtopping of road, you know, something that's in a scale that folks would understand. But it's interesting to see that they do have all of those systems linked in a way. So it may be a little bit more simplistic in the modeling, but also because they have it hooked into their E911, just in the look through of it, it's probably a slightly more automated system. I also had the impression, looking at the documentation on this, they're using a third-party company to help provide these services. I don't know if it's entirely or just for certain portions of it. So it's also more of a turnkey sort of solution for them, where they probably don't have as much staff involved with this. And so this third party is taking the data, doing some work, and then issuing. So in this case, that whole internal box of the system is almost a black box, as opposed to them having as much staff as, let's say, like an urban drainage. So before we get into the risk, any other questions, comments on any of those systems? Okay, so I wanted to come back, if you go to the next slide then. So where I saw, go ahead and give it one more click. So where I saw, I think, where the risk map information and where I think you can leverage best is in the forecasting portion of that overall system of one of these flood forecasts and warnings. Honestly, a lot of the real-time data is best left with the agencies and the groups that do this stuff for a living. So USGS and National Weather Service and the forecasting groups, they're real good at getting to the point where you have kind of up to that data gathering module. So they can provide in information to the point where you then want to then use it to then make a forecast prediction. One of the challenges that we're going to have, I think, with the FEMA-based work is that parts of our modeling systems, the data, obviously like good quality terrain data and hydraulics, can be leveraged, but the like rainfall runoff models, and I don't know, like urban drainage has a good number of those, but overall in Colorado and in the studies that you do, like what percentage would you say would have like an HMS or any sort of?
I mean, it's because of the most 2013 areas. That's kind of an exception. Most of the time, when I can also be some studies.
Right. So if you go to the next slide, so I think where I'm seeing in a typical river reading, go ahead and click the button, is I'm seeing that our peak runoff, and do one more click for me. I'm seeing that probably between hydrology and hydraulics is probably for most watersheds and most locations, that's probably the intersection point that we're first coming out with this. In the hydrology for flooding, because we're doing these single return period events, the way in which we're coming up with a peak flow or a flow value is not really tied into, unless it's based off a rainfall runoff model. It's just dissimilar from a real-time event. So I think in a lot of cases, the hydrology portions of our risk map work unless there's some gauge work involved with it, but especially like a regression equation. Just because a regression equation at some event is, 10 CFS or 10,000 CFS, what does 10,000 CFS mean? In terms of an actual event. So I think in that three-legged stool of the balancing of things in FEMA work, and it's been acknowledged, the reason that we use simplistic models for hydrology in most of FEMA work, one is you could kill yourself to do a really detailed model, and then in the end, let's say you come up with a prediction that's maybe 20 or 30% lower or higher. When you go to then map that on a floodplain, it changes it like 1 inch or 2 inch. So the hydraulics, the sensitivity of the hydraulics and the floodplain elevations to even, unless it's a very steep kind of canyony sort of area, in a lot of cases when your floodplain gets wider, so if you've got like a floodplain that's half a mile wide, that's CFS. Like if you look on your flood profiles between 100 year and a 500 year, you can have the flow double, but then the elevation goes up a foot or two because it's so wide at that point. So a lot of the traditional effort of trying to be more precise is in the terrain and in the hydraulics, where the hydrology, just to balance the available funds to do one of these studies, you use a regression equation, you say it has uncertainty, and you move on. So I think that's, in the valuable information, that hydraulics and then the mapping part is probably the more valuable, although if you do have rainfall runoff, leveraging it, like in the case of urban drainage, would also make sense. So those are the intersection points. What I have on these next couple of slides, so over time, and this is just sort of a picture up to starting with MapMod, when you did a FEMA study, what you ended up getting in some studies, I played for a while with, did I want to make the 10 and the 50 gray checks instead of dark check? I don't know, in Colorado, did most of the older MapMod era studies, were they only the 100 and a little bit of 500, or did they usually have at least 10 and 50 on the
10 and 15?
They would have that usually? Okay. Yeah. So this is where we started off, is that we had modeling, but we only had boundaries for the 100-year, often for 500, and we wouldn't have it for the 100 or the 50. But we at least had some sense of, okay, the flow associated with those events are this, the profiles are this, we have boundaries for some of them. So that was the beginning of our information. If you go to the next one. With RISMAP, we've expanded this. So now we've changed our nomenclature over to the percent annual chance events. We have more events that we've included. So not only do we have the 10, but we also have 25 and 50 and 100 and 500. But we still really didn't map boundaries on a regulatory side, at least, associated with that. So if you give it one more click. But when we add in non-regulatory, we do have the capability now of getting to, and I'll show you what I mean by having boundaries for some of those other events. But we also have our depth grids associated with those events, and we have loss associated with those. So if this table kind of is by default on studies where we're doing a detailed analysis, this is what RISMAP gives us now. What is some of the information then that we could leverage, to build into this forecasting? And when we looked at this, and we saw this in the earlier slides, one is our most frequent event, so our 10% or 10-year event, is that frequent enough? Probably not. Is the 500-year big enough? Probably not. So when you look at the range of events that you want to model or predict, you probably want a wider range than what we do now. But the data and the type of information that we get out with profiles and boundaries, is that something that we also could leverage? And I think it is. So if you go to our next, so the thought that I had with this is the percent annual chance grid, I think, provides us a way of having sort of a composite information that we could start with and use for flood prediction. So this series of slides goes through how this is made, and I don't know, Twee, if you've seen this set before on the phone, but essentially, let's say we have two locations, A and B. So the ground is at a certain elevation for each of these, and as we go through, you can just sort of click through it. As we go, starting with our 10%, and then go up to our 25 or our 4%. And we go through these different events and stop when it gets to the 500 year. So we'll do one more. So the way that percent annual chance works is essentially it's saying for this point on the ground, what is the return period or the percent annual chance event when the ground first gets wet? And the way that it does this is it looks at the depth grids associated with each point, and then it looks at where the ground elevation intersects with the curve of those depth grids. Or in this case, we've got it as water surface. So depth or water surface can be used either of those to derive this. And then what it'll do if you click one more. So for like point A, it's within the 10-year event. So in this case, in our percent annual chance grid, we're going to give it a category of 10% plus. So it's actually, it might even be a 5-year event, but our modeling wasn't that detailed. For the other location for B, it was located somewhere between our 25-year and our 50-year event. In this case, it's saying it's a 3.4% annual chance event. But it was done by taking the rasters associated with those ones that we did model and then interpolating from it. So the cool thing with this, if you go to the next slide, is that this percent annual chance grid really is, you can almost think of it as a composite depth grid. So it's not just one depth or one raster, but you can use this and query it to figure out flooding for a range of events. So go ahead and we'll click. So it goes all the way out to our biggest event, in this case our 500 or our 0.2% annual chance. And it's the most detailed it has, if it's the 10%, then that's, so within that range from the furthest out down to this, every single one of those cells in between, it will make a prediction. So if you click one more, so we've got our given events that go out. So our 50, 2%, and our 100. And then the math that it does in between, if you do one more, these are a bunch. So let's say in our shaded X zone, so out between the 100-year and the 500, it's going to go in, if you give it a click. So the set of cells right along the edge have that 500-year or that 0.2. The ones on the inner edge are the 100, but everything in between. So go ahead and we'll give another. And let's see, let's do one more. So let's say that particular pixel, if it comes in based on the ground elevation, and it gives that pixel a value of the 0.4% or a 250-year event. So what all of this means is that having this percent annual chance event, if I wanted to say, what is the extent of flooding of any return period between the 10-year and the 500, this allows me to do that. So it gives me the extent of flooding. So I can come in and essentially query this. So if you go to the next slide. So if I wanted to know a 33-year event, I could essentially say query the percent annual chance grid, and everything that's a 3% or higher value, there's my 33-year floodplain. Or if you click the next one, if I wanted to know a 1.5% chance, all of that data is embedded in that percent annual chance. So it's a composite of all of the information that we had from the frequencies that we calculated. So I don't know in the studies where you produced non-regulatory how much you've used or not used this for public information. But the cool thing is this one raster we can leverage, and we'll show some slides in a minute, for a lot of this information that we might want to have for flood forecasting. And it wouldn't require new modeling. We actually already have the data available. On the phone, I don't know, have you guys used this at all, like in your public meetings yet?
Not like this, but yeah, we have.
In-depth grids, okay. So the idea that I had for kind of moving forward with this is for flood forecasting, and I just gave some examples of additional percent annual chance events. So you could go all the way down, that 50% would be like a 2-year. For more extreme events, you could go beyond the 500 to 1,000, 2,000. I even, who knows what percent annual chance, but like a PMF, so probable maximum, you know. So the low end or the high end or the more frequent and less frequent, you could definitely expand those out. But the thought that hit me with this, if you click through, is these composite data sets. So right now, I'll give it one more click. Percent annual chance was what's in this red box. So we would have a raster that would have in it a composite of all these different percent annual chance events. So you could ask at any given time, what is the flood inundation limits? How far out will the flooding go for this certain return period? But what's interesting is this table, instead of checks, I could have actually put in the flow. So click once. So for flow, I have checks. I could have actually put for a given river, well, the flow for the 2% is 500 CFS. And for the 20% is, 1,000 CFS. So I could have actually put real numbers in there for that. If you click again, for profiles, I could actually put for my gauge, the stage for this event is this. The stage, I could actually put real numbers in. And for loss, so for a given reach, if I'm doing modeling in something like HAZUS, I could say my 100-year event for this reach has X amount of loss. But for those other events, I also could do that. So when I was looking at this and I was thinking about putting values in here, what I realized is you could actually start with percent annual chance as a raster, if you go to the next slide, and I could actually make additional composite data sets, starting with percent annual chance, and having, so in this case, and we'll be some slides on this, I could take percent annual chance, take the relationship between peak flow and percent annual chance, and come up with a new composite raster, which would be the inundation of flooding based on the flow amount at that particular gauge that I'm looking at. So if I knew at a particular gauge, I now have a rainfall runoff model where the Weather Service has told me I'm going to have 20,000 CFS from this event. I could just go to this composite grid and symbolize it with 20,000 and lower, and all of a sudden I know the inundation limits of that event. So I wouldn't have to run a new model. This particular mapping layer would give me that information, and all I'd have to do is query it and show it, just like the National Weather Service site has. So some of these, and then again, a lot of these are just ideas that we just sort of came up with for sort of, to think through. But if you go to the next slide. So one of these new ones would be, so if you had the question for flood forecasting, what flood inundation would be associated with a certain peak, which might come out of your rainfall runoff models or other things. You could make, and again, these names are also up to discussion as well, but you could make a peak flow composite raster where each cell in the raster has associated with it the flow in that reach when that particular raster for that piece of ground first gets wet. So if you wanted to know, and again, this is only the bottom level of this only goes down to the 10-year, but if I wanted to know, let's say for 30,000 CFS, I could query this raster, show me all the cells that are 30,000 CFS or lower, and then I could symbolize an inundation limit associated with that. So this one new kind of derived data set that you could use for that. Another one, if you go to the next slide, is with the gauge stage. So often when you have a river or stream, gauge that's out there, it's going to measure the actual stage or the relative elevation of that gauge, and then they have a rating curve that goes to the flow. Well, you could just as easily make a composite that says when that gauge is at 18 feet. So this essentially is what the National Weather Service is showing. They're showing you a depth grid, but this would be the inundation. You could still query a depth grid and show depths, but this just gives you an idea for a given stage how wide out the flooding goes. And this honestly, within the range of events we typically do now, you could derive this from any set of non-regulatory data you have now. It's just that we don't have this as a standard product. And remember, with the National Weather Service, there was that sort of upstream and downstream limit associated with that one gauge. So this would be useful around where you have gauges, but obviously outside of that, you would then have to derive something else. So that's another type of kind of a derived or an enhanced raster data set that you could possibly use from RISMAP. And then because I do HAZUS work, if you do this next one, you could also do this with loss. So let's say the question you want to ask is how extensive or what flood inundation would cause $10 million of damage on a given reach around a certain gauge. Again, you could take that relationship of the percent annual chance events with loss. So let's say you did a HAZUS run for different return periods. You could derive that relationship, and then you could make this raster to say, okay, everything that's yellow or orange or red on this, the flooding would have to go out to that limit before I would see 10 million in loss. So in what we do for RISMAP, we're usually looking at, in HAZUS, we're looking at damages to structures. But you could even do some enhanced loss analysis for particular, whether it's roads or railroads or other infrastructure, if you had the data. So this last slide shows this idea. So the sort of the dashed line is a railroad. So you could even come up with some sort of custom asset loss for roads, or in this case, a railroad, to say what inundation limits of flooding would be needed before this railroad starts getting hit. So if the flooding only goes out to the green, then the railroad would still be in good shape. When the flooding goes out to that sort of yellow inundation limit, now you're starting to have a section of it threatened. But at the pink and the red levels of inundation, then that railroad would probably be impassable at that point. So in order to do this analysis, you would have to have separate GIS mapping associated with where these assets are, and then compare that with your flood limits. But in theory, you could do some very specialized, so if you had, critical evacuation routes or critical facilities or any site that is a flood risk or an area that has always been a flood concern in the community, you can actually take something from a RISMAP study, do something customized with this, and then have a library of sort of pre-calculated risks for just that asset. And then as flooding goes up, you could look at, okay, the flooding has come up to this stage, what is that inundation? How does that relate to where that asset is? And that could already be in the can and available. So you wouldn't have to be running a model real time. You would just be basically querying data. All right, that was a lot of information. I guess I'll start with Tweet. I mean, in those ideas, is there anything that sort of sticks out as something that might be really useful or something we might want to look at moving forward?
Yeah, I like these inundation maps. I'm just trying to process everything you just said.
It is.
It's similar to what we have now, but I'm just trying to think the differences of what we have already.
Yeah, I think the key thing is it always comes back to that question you want to ask.
Yeah.
So if a lot of the flood prediction stuff comes back to I have a gauge and the gauge is at this height, do I need to worry at that height? Then maybe like the one that you have up right now with this gauge stage composite would be something that, okay, if I know that the gauge is at 15, is this hitting anything that I worry about? But this, in some ways, because we've already run our models and we've done all the analysis, this composite raster encompasses the information that's in the model, so I don't have to rerun the model. I just have to query this raster data set, and it can show me where so you still would have a person involved with interpreting this, but you wouldn't necessarily have to sit there and run HEC-RAS.
You just have to know the query you want.
Exactly.
Pull the data out to develop the map that you want. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one challenge we'd still have, something like this, is tied to a gauge. So you would still, in between gauges, would have issues of then how do you predict things. But again, you could set up rules that if you have, if gauges are, a certain drainage area is separated, that maybe you would then say if it's 100 you're here and 50 you're here, then the stuff in between is 75 or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can ultimately make the same type of interpolation between gauges. You can
So the only one of these right now that is standard is that percent annual chance. And all of these other ones were really just new ones that we developed for this to start the thought process of how much could you pre-calculate or pre-run some of this information? Because I'd say most of the challenge of getting this sort of raster composite idea, the percent annual chance and all the calculations that go into that, that's where a lot of that more intensive GIS analysis works. But all of this is really just driven, like if you go to the 2 slides back, everything is really driven, one more, it's really driven by the ability to have some sort of rating curve. As long as you can relate percent annual chance to the thing that you want to show, and as long as the relationship is some sort of general trend, you can derive these other sort of rasters from the percent annual chance that you already have.
And that's what you already create with the.
You already create that with, yeah. So this data was actually the sample data I think that you gave Remit.
Yeah. If you give me some depth grids, this I can add some depth grids for this project.
Yeah. So all of this was derived from stuff that we already have.
Yeah, and just kind of in general though. I mean, this is like our for this project. I mean, our intent is after we're done here for Shane to he's of course completed his half life paper. So to have that, in a few weeks for review and then finalize it. So this is also kind of like the initial, and this is kind of what we're doing, and so to get some of that feedback so we can incorporate forums or something like that.
And so one last, if you go right before the second to last slide, you have to go back towards the end. So the one thing, some of the data sets, so do 2 clicks on here, I think. So you can do this composite rasters for some of these, but then for some of the others, if you do one more click, you can actually just have a library of pre-run data. So unfortunately, there's no good way to do a composite depth grid because the depths for different return periods, there's no way to sort of embody that in just one map. So instead, you would just have a database of depths, just like what the National Weather Service does. So if you wanted to know, let's say the depth associated with 100 year, you would just go to this library and pull it out. But if you wanted to know, let's say the depth associated with 150 year, you could set up a routine that it takes the 100 year and the 500, does some interpolation between the two, and then would derive that for you. So that's just something you couldn't pre-calculate like the other composites, but if you have the library from all of these different return periods, it's something that you could, again, it would be a straightforward, you wouldn't have to go back into the model to derive it, you can derive it from the outputs you already have.
Okay. So I know.
Something that you might.
Well, I'm just trying to process because I just can't think that quickly. So basically what you're saying is, I mean, we've got the return period that's really just all interpolation of the raster
Right.
maps. And
Yeah, and in some cases, some of the data, we can make these composite grids, and then you wouldn't have to do any new interpolation, you would just query that. But others like depth grid, you would have to do interpolation with.
okay.
This you can program that in.
Right.
So like you're saying, I want the 72.5 year event and give it, you say that's what I want, and then it converts it to whatever percentage of chance that is, and then it does the math.
Yeah.
So the intent is to, of course, have routines on top.
Yeah.
That make it easier to query the database and make it less interesting to call running around.
I mean, in theory, you could even make a toolbox where someone from the Weather Service or community, from their rainfall prediction model or something else, is okay, it looks like we're going to have peak flow here of 15,000 CFS. I type in 15,000 CFS, behind the scenes it goes and pulls all this other stuff, and then I got it already, and then, okay, well, let's feed the maps to the Weather Service site, let's feed this to our warning system. And so you would still have that step of a person using data, but it's not like they're having to sit there and fight with a running model. You're just simply querying libraries of information you have.
Okay. Got it. David, you still there?
I'm still here. I'm
Okay.
waiting for everybody to wrap up his office.
Okay.
Okay.
So yeah, this is great. So this thing, that's what I'm thinking about as we're going through, talking about personally, what we have now is what we think they want to use. Usually being another standard product. I think we started doing in Colorado. It just would be like 2-year product with a 50% annual fee. I feel like that can provide a lot of benefit, even that low end. Just because it's starting in junior. I think that expecting is really good to have. I feel like, the 500 years is about as good as we're going to get, please return, but we don't need that need that, without getting into more detailed hydrologic analyses with, data and information or anything like that. So I feel like the 2 to 500 would be a really good representation of kind of what is possible, at least what would be good as far as what could be possible to get based on my experience with the Weather Service, like the warning classifications for the city representation, are basically standard no matter what forecast location. You start off at an action stage, and then you got a minor flood stage, then you got major flooding, and then it's basically like your record flood. You really don't have a lot of breakdowns, and to reach one of those flood classifications, the Weather Service is basically an impact statement. Okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And they're really vague, they're really broad, they don't really provide really good information, really actionable information. And what this data would be able to inform would actually, you can actually go ahead and pre-run all of them and essentially create custom warning tiers for each gauge location and custom impact statements, and the Weather Service could then disseminate out and actually end up having actual warnings. Ultimately, the Weather Service will never have to look at any of this data. So it will be already done. Essentially, we would be providing them more detailed impact and losses associated with custom, basically thresholds of what.
Yeah, I think the key would be, like right now, our sort of standard HAZs thing is just we're just looking at houses and structures. But if we know that there's more frequent events, it's really roads, and it's really, a lot of that linear infrastructure that tends to be right next to the river and all those canyons, then do we come up with additional loss analysis, or we add that in as an optional scope item to add in, where we look at what elevations do the roads first get hit, or even like Kim's graph, photos that she showed, that even the water may not go over the road, but then it'll erode the next to it, and there'll be a risk associated with that. So do we need to add additional, like you said, impact classes so that we can establish those thresholds where things that matter or things we have to fix? You can even go through the PA categories of the different things that end up having to get repaired post-disaster, and say, okay, where are these things located in the community and next to the flood sources, and come up with a much more sort of diagnostic and detailed loss estimate, not just every building will get hit or not get hit type of course thing we do now.
And really, also just providing with the thresholds, actually providing like actual maps with those warnings instead of just text. And that's something that maybe become maybe down on the community level. Obviously, I'm trying to get the Weather Service to try to change the way they issue warnings on that car, because that's probably not going to happen. But like utilizing like some of the existing systems, whether it's urban drainage or Fort Collins, some of those were even less EOCs, with getting the data that they can actually get out to people based on the more technical thresholds that we develop with this data. I think it'll be very.
There's a reason Fort Collins is a class 1 CRS is to have it in their system, but to do even better with the CRS, they have to tie the whole system. The next step for them is to tie the whole system. And that would be the next step in our drainage as well. And that means that in addition to the obvious benefit of really having the color through, it leads to some other steps in the process with all the programs.
Well, there's a driver. CRS. CRS is the next step, which I assume not making.
target area is, usually with the study that we obviously got ongoing and we're working on as an air recruiter, push that extra CRS and really start tying that together.
When you've got the models running, so you've got a good, fresh HEC-RAS and it's on the machine and the machine's all optimized for it, the extra work involved with pushing a few more peaks through there, especially if they're in between ones you've already done or even that 2-year, is a minimal effort at that point. But God forbid 5 years later you go back to the MIP and try to download it and use it, and that's almost next to impossible sometimes. So if you can leverage it as you're doing the study, that's the ideal time to get this extra information. And then a lot of this other stuff is just post processing of information you already have. So.
And that's where we're at right now with cash and that, hydraulics. It'd be a good time to, leverage a couple runs on a couple of starts.
Yeah, and the other thing we were kind of brainstorming about before we got here too is we have obviously doing all this modeling for the Plant project and also have discovery going on the Big Thompson. So one of our ideas was also to maybe see how we can, especially since flood study needs have already been identified for Big Thompson because of Florida hazard mapping, we're going to talk mitigation, action application, things like that. What about taking a piece of Big Thompson and also include some of this conceptually in the discovery effort? I
think that's a good idea.
Because we're going to get lots of good data, lots of good LiDAR, and that's the most important thing about the project.
Yep.
So that's another one where we could maybe take a piece of Big Thompson and kind of use that as our pilot. But I think ultimately, that's a target product.
Yeah, I think that area is definitely some areas especially if it's great. Same range too, all of it can have everything really going on at the same time. So they're all very, especially just having those basically, that's going to be 3 watersheds stacked up right on top of each other. Big range, Big Thompson, 3 adjacent watersheds. And you have all of that information.
Yeah, especially with, of course, Boulder, St. Vrain also being covered by drainage. You got some sort of kind of there's at least overlap is key here too. But yeah, I think the amount of hydraulics and fluid mapping is going to be created over the next year. And then potentially, if CDCD addresses the South Plan, that could be its own. This could really be